Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lynn Videcka, Dean of the School of Social Work, and it's my real pleasure to welcome you to our second Conversations Across the Social Science Disciplines this semester. I wasn't able to be here for the first one. I heard it was terrific, and I'm thrilled to be here today. This event is a wonderful opportunity for our doctoral students to plan a program. Can we give a shout out to the planners of today's program? Let's see hands. This program helps to increase dialogue and discussion and create models for working across the social science disciplines and social work. It bridges boundaries and encourages collaboration, and that's what we're all about at Michigan, right? Everyone agrees to that at Michigan, and that's one of the proud traditions of our university. This model is, this event, Conversations Across Social Disciplines, is modeled after a similar approach that was established by our late professor of psychology, Joe Veroff. And Joe Veroff was a giant in the field. When I was a doctoral student at another institution, required reading was the Inner American and other works that Joe and his colleagues wrote. And he was, of course, a major figure in our doctoral program as well. This event honors the memory and careers of both Professor Veroff and Catherine Pavelka-Luke. Professor Beth Reed, when she speaks, will share a few words about Professor Veroff and Catherine Pavelka-Luke, so you'll learn more about them in a few minutes. I want to thank Professor Beth Reed, Professor Emerita Letha Chidia, she couldn't be with us today, and Professor Emerita Barrett Ingersoll Dayton, along with the families and friends of Professor Veroff and Catherine Pavelka-Luke. Due to their generosity and leadership, we now have an endowed fund that provides annual financial support to make this program possible. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our excellent director of the doctoral program, Willie Elliott.
Papers, but I don't have any prepared remarks. So. But I do want to say I'm very excited, first of all, to have this event. I think it really typifies what the PhD program is supposed to be about. We have a joint PhD program. This is about building conversations across disciplines. Even while I was sitting in the audience, I got a chance to speak to Henry real quick. He says he's a history major, right? And I was thinking to myself, I never really thought about addiction in history. And he actually teaches a class on addiction, correct? So I think those the kinds of conversations and the kind of things we want to happen in this type of event. Somebody from anthropology is here. I'm sure there's other disciplines represented. And that really is the kind of idea and what we want to model within the joint program is that we create these conversations across disciplines and think about that. I want to make one more note. I read the title, that Critical Dialogue on Addiction, Bridging Theories and Practices from Feminist Viewpoints. I think that is also just fitting for the moment in our history and in our time, in the sense of there's such problems around addiction right now, such conversations around it. So I think it's a very fitting moment to have this kind of conversation. And we also understand that there's quite a big movement around feminist movement at the same time. So I think this is really an outstanding event organized well by Yoon and others. And Beth has taken quite the leadership role in making sure this comes about and continues to be a prosperous event. We really appreciate her leadership. And I'm going to turn it over to her now. Beth, thank you.
My task is to tell you a little bit more about Joe Veroff and Catherine Luke, which always makes me want to cry. So, and to also talk to you about the criteria that are used for these proposals, because we drew those criteria from the lives of these two people, and I should say they were like 40 years apart in age. We don't think they knew each other. It had more to do with those of us who founded this wanting to find a way to honor them, and in conversations about them realizing that they really had some characteristics that were very similar, although in different generations. So one of the criteria is across disciplines. Joe got his PhD when social psychology was both sociology and psychology. So he got imprinted on doing some cross-disciplinary work, and he mentored everybody across all fields. He was Letha's major mentor. She was in anthropology. He reached out to new faculty. Everybody came and went from his home. We all shared his children. And he just was a very interdisciplinary and nurturing person. And so was Catherine. She was also into all kinds of mentoring, more peer mentoring, and looking out for all of her peers. And in fact, she mentored me if I would let her. And also very multidisciplinary. She was in sociology and social work, but drew from psychology, had done social policy work, she'd done clinical work. She was interested in anthropology. I dragged her off to learn something about neuroscience. She wasn't too happy about that, but they were also both very theoretical, both with the capital T and a small t, and very concerned about creating knowledge and frameworks for things, but also about the application of that knowledge. And a lot of the questions they were working on really grew from their concerns about people. Lynn has already told you about Joe's groundbreaking work on mental health, and he did a lot of that work with Libby Duvan, who was one of the early feminist thinkers in psychology. And his last book was on savoring, which tells you something about also both of them, which they were into being positive in the world and making the world a better place and having fun along the way. It wasn't all about fixing problems. Catherine's dissertation was actually on alcohol and drug use and pickup culture and hookup culture from an intersectionality perspective, and not to be anti either hookups or alcohol and drug use, but more how do we learn how those things are intertwined, and how do we help people do it safely? And obviously violence was a big piece of those concerns. They were also very concerned with as I said, making a difference in the world and crossing boundaries. And both of them had significant challenges too. Joe had polio as a child and had major challenges through his whole life with the residuals of all of that. And I know I once stopped to try and pick him up. He used to say he had to walk to work because he needed the exercise. He was trying to keep his muscles as strong as they could be. And it was pouring or snowing or something. And I stopped and tried to convince him that I should give him a ride to the office. And he just wouldn't do it. No, I'm enjoying this, he said. And Catherine too, she was diagnosed 3 months after she defended her dissertation and died 2 weeks later. And during those 2 weeks, she was working hard on taking care of everybody else and thinking about how she was going to get pieces of her dissertation published. So we honor them and are trying to operationalize who they were through these sessions. Young Chen, who is the stellar person who pulled us all together and has worked with us to try and get clear about what our foci are and kind of crack the whip a little bit. She is in her second year of the joint program in anthropology and social work, interested in thinking about addictions in China, and pulling from a lot of different disciplines in the process. So thank you for doing that.
For the lovely introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yuying Chen. I'm a second-year doctoral student in the joint program of social work anthropology at the University of Michigan. And I am the student coordinator for the Conversations Across Social Discipline panel today. Thank you all very much for coming today. So many of us sitting in the audience may be drawn to this panel by the keyword addiction, either from our practice experiences or from our research interest, or both. However, do we all share, without question, a common definition of addiction, a common understanding of its causes and effects, or a common belief of how it should be intervened. Addiction, is it a moral failing, a brain disease, a symptom of capitalism, or a mode of existence? Addiction intervention should be oriented towards therapeutic self-transformation, biomedical treatment, incarceration, or harm reduction. These various conceptualizations of addiction have been vibrantly debated among scholars from different disciplinary backgrounds. They have also shaped the real-life models of addiction interventions and policies at various degrees across time and space. In today's panel, we invite scholars from several disciplines, social work, psychology, nursing, anthropology, to share with us how addiction has been conceptualized, as well as how addiction interventions have been and could be modeled from their diverse perspectives. More particularly, we want to highlight the impact of feminism in the areas of research and practice. Here in the introduction, I want to give a very broad sense of feminism, and that each of our panelists will elaborate in different ways from their own angle. The feminist viewpoints, in the plural form, are not merely about highlighting one side of all those familiar dichotomies, such as male and female, nature and culture, production or reproduction, but they're about opening up space to examine the taken for grantedness of these dichotomies and to ask critical yet constructive questions, such as how does sex differences of laboratory objects affect scientific understandings of the neurobiological mechanism of addiction? How do addiction and addiction intervention operate upon, reinforce, and reproduce sociopolitical disparities across intersectional categories such as gender, sexuality, race, class, and indigeneity? Or how may addiction actually become a mode of communal existence in the context where violence, instability, and deprivation are the main themes of everyday life? The feminist viewpoints urge us to re-examine the presumptions and efficacies of our current addiction intervention models by bringing in critical insights from intersectionality. With all these being said, it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce our panelists today. I will give a very brief introduction here, and they will each talk more about how their own individual disciplinary background inform their approaches to addiction. Dr. Jill Becker is the Dr. Jill Becker is the Patricia Y. Gurin Collegiate Professor of Psychology at the University of Michigan. Trained as a neuroscientist, Dr. Becker's research focuses on sex differences in and sexual differentiation of neurosystems mediating drug abuse and motivation. Her laboratory research seeks to tie behavior measures to underlying neurobiological mechanisms whose findings generate dialogues with clinical literatures as well. Dr. Beth Glover-Reed is Associate Professor of Social Work at the University of Michigan. She also has a joint appointment in Women's Studies. Dr. Reed's research projects tie together interventions on alcohol and other drug problems and intimate partner violence, with the emphasis on intersectionality and social justice. Her work also focuses on educational strategies and other interventions to promote practices of social justice and social change. Dr. Carol Boyd is the Deborah J. Oakley Collegiate Professor in the Department of Health Behavior and Biological Sciences in the School of Nursing at Michigan. She also holds appointment in Women's Studies as well as Addiction Center at Department of Psychiatry. She's the director of the Center for the Study of Drugs, Alcohol, Smoking, and Health. Dr. Boyd's research uses a mixed method to examining the relationship between gender, health, and substance use, with a particular focus on women of color, adolescents, and emerging adults. Her projects developed innovative survey methods in this field. Dr. Katie Schultz is an assistant professor of social work at the University of Michigan. Her research draws on community-based participatory research approaches with a focus on American Indian and Alaska Native health equity. She examines the violence and its health outcomes among women and girls in Native communities from sociohistorical and structural perspectives, and she promotes culturally centered intervention designs. Dr. Elizabeth Roberts is Associate Professor of Anthropology at Michigan. She is ethnographer of critical studies of science, medicine, and technology. Dr. Roberts' work has focused on assisted reproduction in the United States and Ecuador, reproductive governance in Latin America, transnational medical migration, as well as environmental health science in the United States and Mexico. Currently, she is directing 2 collaborative projects in Mexico City with scholars from public health and related fields on the dynamics between water quality, health equity, and neighborhood politics. In the next hour, each of our panelists will give a 10-minute presentation on how they got into addiction research and intervention from their disciplinary background, and how have feminist viewpoints impacted their work on addiction. They will also share some of their research findings and practical insights on this topic. Also, they will also talk about how do they think could or should feminist viewpoints bring into advancing our knowledge and intervention on addiction. So after all the presentations, we will have about 30 minutes Q&A session during which we'll open the floor for questions and comments. Please join me in welcome our first panelist, Dr. Jill Becker.
So thank you so much for asking me to be part of this. I'm a little bit of the odd man out here, but okay. And just to make it very clear, my laboratory studies rats. I once gave a talk and a colleague said it was like halfway through my talk before they realized that I was speaking about rats and not humans. So I'm just starting off right at the beginning. So in terms of how I think about addiction as a neuroscientist, I know that it varies with the discipline, but and we always have these different types of ways of thinking about things. But in my discipline, we're thinking about the neurotransmitters involved, the genes involved, and most of the molecular and biochemical changes that are associated with that. And yet, I study males and females, and as a feminist who grew up in the 80s, I know that there were times when sex differences in the brain were used as something that was used against women because they were different. So I've always strived to show how differences aren't necessarily the same as one sex being better than the other. But we do know that there are differences in addiction. So in neuroscience, we define addiction in medical terms. And that's primarily because people had thought that that was a way to destigmatize addiction. It's not necessarily been shown to be the case that that works, but we think of addiction as the consequences of how the substances are acting on the brain to result in compulsive behaviors. And that's when I'm modeling addiction in my rats, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm developing an animal model that has some of the same behavioral characteristics as what we define addiction in the DSM-5. And the treatment is usually thought of in terms of medications or cognitive behavioral therapy that change the way the brain works in order to cure addiction or treat addiction. Now, one of the biggest challenges I have as a neuroscientist are to define sex differences in a way that help my colleagues think about what it means to be male or female, because most people think that all females are like this and all males are like that, and we know that that's not true. So I've been publishing different ways of thinking about sex differences. Some differences are bimodally distributed. Only women can have babies, only men make sperm, but at the same time, there are lots of other things we do where the behaviors are overlapping, but one sex may have more of a certain behavior than the other. Sometimes when we're looking at the neuroscience of it, what we see is that the behavior is exactly the same, but the way the brain is working is different for males and females, or even the molecular structure. So I keep trying to make people understand that there are many different ways to be feminine and masculine, especially as we're looking at addiction. And so that means that even though we know there are developmental, this is a really complicated slide. Just look at this box. Okay, the box is all that's the really important point for this particular point, and that is that even though we know there are biological influences that result in sex differences in the brain, there are also these contingent internal and external factors, developmental influences, all which are acting on a sexually dimorphic brain in order to produce masculine and feminine phenotypes, people, genders of various descriptions and orientations. And as a result, what you end up with is individuals which are much more like a mosaic of various traits, which some might define as more or less masculine or feminine, but in fact, those are more cultural attributions of those traits rather than anything that the brain has decided to do differently. So in my laboratory, what I'm trying to understand is how it is that there might be differences in the motivation to take drugs of abuse. And one of the things I know is that males don't tend to have, or at least male rats and males of many species. So I'm always thinking about rats, so I'm sorry. I try to think like a rat. That's part of what I do when I'm designing my experiments. But female rats respond to the hormones of pregnancy, and there's a very rapid bond formed with the young, which happened immediately upon parturition. It doesn't happen if the hormones haven't been greater during pregnancy. So if you just have pups given to a female rat, she won't show maternal behavior. But if these hormonal changes have happened and then she's delivered these babies, she becomes very rapidly maternal. So her brain has been rewired to form this rapid attachment to the young. And so I think that part of the sex differences, and I'm saying sex because rats primarily have sex differences rather than gender differences, are due to this neurochemical attribute which allows them to rapidly form a bond with their young. And when it turns out it's this neurochemical called dopamine, and dopamine is also released with all drugs of abuse. So when dopamine is released at parturition, it is in part acting on a brain in response to the hormones that causes there to be a rapid attachment to the young. And I believe that drugs of abuse take over this system to some extent in women. It's not that I always try to make sure people understand that biology is not destiny. It's not that this is necessarily going to happen. It's just that this is a bias in the brain that we need to be aware of, this rapid formation of an attachment to drugs of abuse. And I see this in my female rats. If I give male rats and female rats a choice between this tasty banana-flavored pellet or cocaine, female rats choose the cocaine more rapidly than the male rats do. And so over a course of 5 weeks, the females choose cocaine within 2 or 3 weeks, the males take longer, and a greater percent of the females choose cocaine over pellets. So in the laboratory, we model this more rapid formation of addiction-like behaviors. You can see similar rapid attachment to drugs of abuse in humans. You don't have to look at this. It's just to remind me to tell you that this rapid attachment to drugs of abuse occurs across classes of drug taking in men and in women, and we can model that in rats, and that's what we do in the laboratory. So what I've been trying to tell you about from the neuroscience perspective is that there are biological sex differences that influence how and the rate at which individuals become addicted. I believe that it's more of a population difference. There are certain individuals, both males and females, who have this tendency. It's just that women or rats, at least female rats, are more likely to form this attachment at a rapid rate. The biological factors do not predict whether an individual is going to become addicted in the absence of other social and environmental phenomenon. And I'm trying to make sure people think about sex differences in the brain within the context of the sociocultural influences that are going to be affecting behavior. And so things like the internal event diet, stress, neglect can all have dramatic effects on addiction liability in both males and females. And the sociocultural experiences can influence addiction in important ways, but we need to be aware that there are biological differences as well.
How did you get into addictions?
So Beth, I forgot to tell you how I got into addictions work. And the truth is, what I told you about that motivation and the sex differences in motivation, that's really where my heart lies, and trying to understand, the motivation to engage in sexual behavior and how it is that females have a greater difficulty with this motivation. But the funding agencies are not really very interested in paying to understand why women don't want to have sex or do want to have sex. They'll spend lots of money on Viagra, but they're not interested in women and sex. So since the same neural systems are important for addiction, I started studying addiction as a way to understand what's going on in terms of motivation in the brain.
So I'm going to shift to the sociocultural side. And I should say, Jill and I have been working pretty closely together for the last 4 or 5 years. And six? Okay. We've had to do a lot of translating to get to the point that we can see the overlap in these fields. But so I really want to talk to you about stigma and the larger societal stuff. And where am I poking there? This one?
Pointing is
okay. I got it. So I'll start with my major commitment to addiction is really about social justice. It's an area in which it's such a highly stigmatized area with all kinds of injustices and social systems that are gendered in unrecognized ways, where intersectionality and race and economic class and a lot of social control interacts. So I got involved I've stayed involved partly because of my commitment to trying to make the world a more just place, and also to understand how systems of oppression get instantiated within our social systems and social policies. There are other reasons why I've been I want to say almost crazy enough to stay in the field. And one is it really requires interdisciplinarity. I have to understand enough biology to make sense of what Jill's doing, and enough anthropology. And I've always been multidisciplinary. And also I'm a community and a clinical psychologist. So I did both micro and macro in graduate school. I had a lot of unplanned encounters with addiction. Some of them in my family, some of them my advisors in college were doing research on drugs, and in fact taking them themselves in very controlled ways. It was back in the psychoactive hippie period where everybody was trying to understand how all those things worked. And one of them ended up being the drug abuse prevention person at the Department of Education. So I encountered her later, and one of my professors was teaching a whole course on prevention of mental health and mental illness. And so in the early stages of all those fields, I ended up being liaison for one of the first drug crisis centers in the country, which was developed. And in fact, I met Marvin when I moved here, and we were both on the board of the drug crisis center here. But they were developed because professionally trained people were doing such a terrible job. They were letting people die in emergency rooms, and they were sending people out to all the raves and things. They didn't call them raves then, but and then I was very invested in community and school change, and a lot of the funding and impetus for that was coming from concerns about drug abuse when youth were doing so many drugs at that point in time. So, and then the gender bias just really came from my own survival and the fact that the whole areas of psychology I was taught about were very biased around gender. So just to survive. So definitions of addiction, it really depends on which hat of all those ones. Some definitions of addiction would be that it's a mechanism of oppression and it's a way to keep people we don't care about out of society and give us an excuse to put them in jail and or mental hospitals or and the idea of disease, more like a dis-ease with society. But the most common in medical is really the not being able to stop behaviors that are causing you harm or causing other people harm. And I will focus mostly on alcohol and other drugs, even though we're talking about all of addictions, just because that's my history here. But a lot of them do. And here's some of the kinds of things I've done over the years. I'm not going to run through them all, but I was the evaluator and then the coordinator for the first NIDA-funded demonstration projects for women when we were first trying to figure out what treatment should look like for women, which is when I first met Carol. I've done a lot of participatory action research. I studied the policies of how all 50 states were trying to upgrade what they were doing for women and treatment. I was part of the coordinating center for the Women Co-occurring Disorders and Violence study, which is where a lot of the trauma-informed work is coming from now. And that project came out of a lot of activism in mental health, substance abuse, and the violence fields. And now I'm trying to look at the interface between intimate partner violence and substance abuse. So let me just say a few things about all of this, and I'm going to focus on the change efforts in the fields to try and get more gender sense. Addicted women have always been stigmatized, and I think it's not just drug and alcohol addicted women. It's lots of addicted women with different kinds of addictions, much more stigmatized than men engaged in the same behaviors. And they're also doubly deviant because a lot of these fields were developed for men. So they are not proper women. They are also not proper addicts. So they're fit with not fitting into either set of systems. And now Rapping argued that the recovery movement never would have happened without feminism, but it did not make treatment options and prevention options anymore for women. It may have changed the culture in a way that I suspect Liz might raise, but didn't really change the options for women that were struggling with things. With the exception of a campaign against overprescribing psychoactive drugs, which the women's health movement took on in the early 70s, no arm of the women's movement has ever paid consistent attention to addiction. And as I tried to think about why is that, it's not because some of us haven't tried to get it on the health agenda or on the criminal justice agenda. That always falls right back off again. And I think it's because this double stigma that the women's movement and feminism actually has not wanted to take it on as an issue. Despite that, we've managed to change a lot of things over 40 years. But one of my points for those of you who think about change in the macro world, the strategies have all been what people might call tempered radicalism, as opposed to typical social action or even advocacy strategies, although advocacy is one of the things that tempered radical, which is you have a radical agenda, but you have to work within systems and be socially acceptable in those systems in order to not get thrown out of those systems so that you can work to change them. And there's a whole network of people who created a lot of women-centered approaches that really have been advocating and pushing here and pushing there, with often using very coded, non-traditional language, rarely using the F word, feminism. So anyway, I'm adapting here for some feminist frameworks for change. The idea that there's always been a tension between, do you try and make the current system work better and be more fair, or do you try and create alternatives to the current system? And Lorber also talks about those in two ways, that resistance means really working outside the current system, and a lot of the women's specific services have really been in parallel to the current system and not infused in the current system. But then there's transformative, like how do you actually change the system altogether in a way that you're not having to keep adding things on? Because when you add things on, they're the first things to fall off when funding gets tight or the advocates retire or whatever. So I'm just tracking here some of what we did try and do. And one of the early things was raising consciousness and reframing everything so that people could see gender differences. Originally, they talked about women were sicker than men, less motivated than men, and more sexually deviant than men. And when we discovered all the data about telescoping, so women hadn't been using as long with many, many more severe consequences, the field just assumed they lied more than men did. So that instead of saying maybe there's something biological or environmental going on here, the women just were not good reporters about how long and how much they'd been using. They were sicker than men, partly because they were depressed and anxious, and the field was used to men acting out and getting into trouble with the law. 1-3 versus 4-9 on the MMPI, if you want to get technical in psychology. But in fact, it's easier to work with depression and anxiety if you know how. Because their emotions are right there. And services didn't have most of the work that they did. So reform was to really try and sneak some things into existing programs. It would often mean things like another entrance so that women didn't have to go through the gauntlets of catcalls and getting groped as they even came into the program. And adding things like women's groups, attention to the arts works very well with women, women-specific health things, new approaches to outreach and engagement that handled the barriers to treatment, and the not being motivated had to do with having a bazillion more barriers and having referral systems that were set up to work for men and not for women. So essentially they blamed the women, and incidentally the sexually deviant was that they were incest survivors and they'd all been raped. And those weren't even questions that they asked the men. So we did create a whole bunch of women-specific alternatives. There's now a whole network of what they call gender-specific programs, but really are not gender, it's women-specific programs. We have not transformed to think about how does male gendering influence addiction. And the 12 steps, the first 2 steps are about male coping styles. Women don't have those coping styles. So we've had to write books about how can women use the 12 steps, because the 12 steps were developed for men. So we linked with other feminist initiatives, major work trying to get other women's initiatives to take on addiction, and we'd succeed for a little while and then it would go away. And there's just a list of some of the things that are happening. And I would say with transformation is mostly not happening, even now. Now there are, and so here's the tempered radicalism diagram, where you really have to work through the legislators, through the administrative things. We mold into all these folks who tried to get co-op senators, and the citizen advocacy has been very largely missing from efforts to change. So my concerns, and then I'll end, I'm out of time, is that they're getting more established, but there's some critique of them, and they're largely a separate system from the generic substance abuse treatment models. Aging tempered radicals are working really hard to replace themselves, because there was a whole generation that doesn't have their consciousness and was brought in without the idea that you had to really work to sustain all these things. Now, new models of addiction are making it much easier for women. Trauma-informed works for women way better. New research on brain stuff. The push to involve primary care, motivational interviewing is way more consistent with women's styles. Recovery-oriented systems of care also gets people out in the community and engages with barriers to things. But they're largely absent any gender or feminist analysis. So we're dealing with trauma without thinking about where's that trauma come from. And the fact that a lot of these women are living in violent environments. And the coded language that we've had to use may also obscure these things. So people used relational models of feminism and not power and oppression models of feminism, because you could sell that. But it means then we're not paying attention to power. So those are all, and I should say there was a summit I was invited to a couple of years ago where they were really trying to tackle this problem of this separate system of largely residential programs, because you could protect children when they were in residence. How could we move to make it more available to people and get it neighborhood based? And three major things just kept coming up. Cost, both to the women, and but violence is the things that the child welfare system has been dealing with for years. Suddenly the substance abuse system was trying to think about home visits and working with people in their families when there's active violence. And then children, because many women are still responsible for children, and if they aren't, they want to be. And so you have to worry about not just the woman, but all the people she cares about in her life.
And it's,
This one.
this one.
Yeah, I think the arrow's been worn off.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm Carol Boyd, and I'm a nurse, and it has taken me a long time to say I'm just a nurse. So I feel like I've finally grown up now that I'm saying I'm a nurse. I came to this field as a staff nurse in Detroit. My peers didn't want to work with drug users, and so I was assigned to the floor that had the drug users on it. And I was a child of the 60s and became fascinated with what was so similar between me, my friends, and the drug users that I was seeing in the emergency room at Detroit Receiving Hospital. So today then I'm going to talk about women, gender, and drugs. And I'm having a little, I'm going to have to turn because I can't quite see those slides. But I'm going to talk about nursing and feminist perspectives, because nursing really comes to this very differently. And in many ways, I share a lot with Beth personally and in my own research, but I'm going to focus a bit more on nursing today. Our professional experiences are in a system of male privilege and Western medicine dominance. So we come to thinking about drug users, but ourselves in a system of patriarchy. And we see that in many of our writings and even our focus. Florence Nightingale remains one of our very honored figures. And part of it is that she wrote about vulnerable populations. She wrote about reducing hierarchy, and she also focused on the environment and how it is that people who need us, who need the care and the touch that nurses give. We're one of the few disciplines that spends as much time touching the human body, and what it is that we bring then to caring and health. We have always focused on health disparities. It goes back again to Florence Nightingale, but it has been understood even when I was being educated in the early 70s to a relationship between gender, age, sexuality, age, and social location, although the metrics on that have changed, or the valence has changed as we've progressed, I will say. We're trained to focus on creating an environment where patients and clients are put in the best position for health and healing to occur. We never make a diagnosis. We will not make the diagnosis of addiction or drug dependence, even though as a profession we follow the DSM-5, which focuses on craving intolerance and and not meeting your social roles or social expectations. But in general, the feminist nurses have really veered away from any definition of addiction because, again, they focus on putting the person in the best position for health and healing to occur. And we focus on the understanding of the environment and how an individual's behaviors within the context of their environment can pertain to their physical and mental health. So I can best be described as somebody who follows the drugs. And I always think of myself as kind of a smack, crack, and pills person. It began with personalized nursing, and this is where Beth comes into my life. Personalized nursing was developed by my mentor, Dr. Marcia Anderson, who was the first PhD nurse to graduate from the University of Michigan, and Beth was her mentor. And Marcia turned out to be my mentor, and that's how Beth and I met. And Marcia and I focused on IV drug use from a feminist perspective, and we focused on women who were admitted to Detroit Receiving Hospital, where I work, who were using T's and Blues or heroin they were injecting. And Beth is right. In the 70s, feminists were the first to take on and say that we really needed to focus on prescription opioids because we saw so many women dying from T's and Blues overdoses. The next, I follow the drugs, though, because I am NIDA funded and have been funded all my career through extramural funding for my research. And as Jill said, you have to follow the drugs and the money. So I moved from IV drug use to crack and focused on the most vulnerable population of crack users, which were urban African American. And then in 2002, I was picking up on some of my surveys that kids, particularly and emerging adults, college students on this campus, were starting to engage in prescription pill use. And I then went and got funded for many years to study prescription stimulant and opioid abuse and anxiolytics. So that's my career as I begin to talk about some other things. Oops, I'm sorry, I went backwards. On button. Okay, and now I'm currently funded to look at, and again, this fits well with nursing's focus on vulnerable populations and those most at risk using certain drugs. I'm currently funded to look at sexual identity, particularly lesbians and bisexual women, and the severity of their drug use. We have known for many, many years that these subpopulations among us are at higher risk for using drugs, but we used that as a proxy for whether they were using them and had more severe complications from it. And what we, of course, which shouldn't surprise us, we understand now is that subpopulations of sexual minorities actually are at much higher risk for severity of the disorder. And of course, that relates directly to impairment and how nurses are going to engage with these subpopulations in terms of putting them in the best position for health and healing to occur. Let me talk about personalized nursing for a moment, because that was the very first nursing intervention to be funded by NIDA. It was developed by University of Michigan, Marcia Anderson. It was aimed at reducing hierarchy. The nurses worked with women in their communities. We worked with women who did not want to quit their drug use. We worked on problems of their choice. And then we, through that, we believed that we would increase their well-being. We defined addiction as a health problem and not as a moral issue. And our goal was to assist drug-addicted clients to improve their sense of well-being. Personalized nursing did, in fact, increase well-being, although nobody really wanted to fund nurses to go into the communities because it was too expensive. So in that sense, personalized nursing didn't really make it to prime time. But these are some of the findings from our work, and I'm happy to share the publications. Safe housing was a major problem at that time. Motives to use were different than men's. Women had many reproductive health problems that were contributing to their use of drugs, and women appeared to get sicker quicker. And everybody has mentioned that before, and that was a pretty robust finding. But drug use goes in cycles, and as that crack as the heroin epidemic was stabilizing, crack became available, and it changed the demographics of who was using. And again, nurses began to focus on, again, these vulnerable women who were living in urban areas. Terms such as crack whore, crack mom, crack babies became popular. And feminists, particularly Carol Roberts, myself, of course, then others who are not nurses, really fought against these terms. And we moved away from heroin, started looking at crack. We were looking, and again, I'm drawing now only from the nursing research, but it really coalesces. I mean, it's really very, very similar to my colleagues, and that is that we believe that there should be assessments for sexual assault history and advocated for that. We advocated for gender-specific treatment programs. Our research supported that. In outpatient settings, we argued for same-sex group sessions, and in particular, we took on things like 12-step programs and the belief that they were not being gender sensitive. We argued that women needed to live in children needed to live in residential programs. Women's comorbidities needed to be treated because of their high rates of PTSD and depression. And again, environment and community were important. But as the crack epidemic was stabilizing, drug researchers began looking towards the next problem. And one thing at that time we knew is that it was not going to be amphetamines. And in fact, it became pills. And what I became interested in at this time is how it was that girls were using pills differently than boys, how they were exchanging them, who they were exchanging with. What we learned in our crack studies were that women were initiated to crack by men in opposite sex relationships, and that this had big implications for treatment, right? Well, I was curious to know if with the opioid epidemic, if in fact that was true as well. And even in populations, and I'm not talking about Appalachia or pain populations, but even on this college campus, our pill users women are being introduced by opposite sex to the pills. So something holds steady across all of these drugs, and that is that for women, it's the opposite sex relationships, which is the context in which they tend to initiate drugs. And so our current focus then for nursing and interventions were that we remain concerned about health. How is it that we're going to prevent what the next epidemic is going to be? And how is it that we're going to put our patients in the best position for healing to occur, which in this case would be to reduce drug use? Hopefully, so that they abstain. But we understand that they may not abstain. We want them to be in the best position for healing to occur. So we remain focused on the most vulnerable. We focus on assessment and brief interventions, and the nursing literature is rich with those. We focus on overdose, and I draw your attention to Dr. Gina Dallam's work in naloxone, my team's own work on the ABCs of safe prescription management, and Clayton Schumann. These are all nurses on campus who are publishing on NAS. And his interest is in how is it that we can get nurses and social workers and all caregivers to, when women are delivering and their baby has been exposed to an opioid, why is it that these mothers are not being told and talked to about breastfeeding? Why? Because nurses say, you're going to be giving them a drug, right? In the breast milk. And yet what do? We give them the babies a little morphine to prevent withdrawal. Why not let them breastfeed? So Clayton's work, and this is really typical of the kinds of things that nurses in my field are looking at. So my parting comments. Nurses resist the hierarchy often seen in medical practice, and our interventions are usually aimed at reducing that hierarchy. Most often when you talk to nurses, you do sense this true irritation with physicians and the role that we play in the medical school. And not that that's necessarily right, but you certainly feel it because many of us have felt for too long that we're just a nurse. We focus on the most vulnerable and how they start, and we are now paying attention to gender, sex differences and how feminist viewpoints are taking place outside of the field of addiction. And you know what? This slide, somehow I'm going to forget that slide because there is a cut and paste there that doesn't make any sense. So let me just conclude then. I really do apologize for that. and maybe it was right, but I don't want to say it anyway right now. So what I want to say is that how is it that I came to addiction? I came as a staff nurse. How does my field define addiction? They tend to define it as a health problem, and they stay away from things like somebody's an addict or a drug or drug dependent, and yet all of us who are funded through the NIH, we tend to adopt the definitions of the medical practice and use DSM-5, including myself. When I talk about drug use severity, I am talking about a DSM-5 diagnosis. That said, I think that feminist nurses have universally focused on putting the woman in the best position for health and healing to occur, and that involves reducing hierarchy, understanding gendered behaviors around drug use, and also the gendered behaviors that nurses engage in when they're dealing with them. Thank you.
The unmarked button.
Yeah, it's the one without the
Yeah.
arrow, I know.
Well, I'm a proud social worker, and I'm about to, I'm pretty persuaded by this feminist nursing perspective to my right. That was fantastic. I come at it a little differently too. I'm going to talk, I have encountered addiction as a function of my interest in responding to violence against American Indian and Alaska Native women. I'm a tribal citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. I've worked in Native health inequities and disparities research for quite a while now, and quickly realized that in examining violence against women, we couldn't avoid substance misuse and addictions. If I think about my work in terms of epidemiology and interventions, we're really talking about causes and consequences of violence against women, and we quickly run into substance misuse, right? And in the literature we see, are you at risk as someone who engages in substance misuse? Is it a consequence of violence? And that's really driven my interest in understanding the literature. And I find it interesting and a little discouraging that funding also comes into play. I was quickly told as a doctoral student who wanted to focus on intimate partner violence that nobody funds intimate partner violence. It either results in substance misuse or it results in mental health. So you go to NIDA or you go to NIMH. So figure it out. So I'm going to talk quickly about what we do know about addictions in tribal communities and Native populations. We, as many other underrepresented communities, often fall into the other category. So we don't have great national data sets to talk about this. We do have smaller community-based samples. We do know that we are at disproportionate risk for using, and particularly unhealthy styles of using. Primarily, historically, the focus has been on the use of alcohol. There's some smaller studies around prescription drug use. Opioids are becoming more of a focus in our community. And tobacco has been and remains disproportionately high rates of use among American Indian Alaska Native populations. We also know that we have unique patterns of using. So in terms of drinking, there tends to be a bimodal distribution for Native communities. So we have a lot of folks that don't drink at all, and a lot of folks that binge and have really unhealthy patterns of use, and not very many people in the middle. We often talk in my community and in my community of researchers about the lack of focus on social drinking or sort of harm reduction models for alcohol. It's become a very stigmatized issue within our communities. We also know that there is vast variability across tribal communities. So we run into a little bit of a problem when we have larger data sets that want to erase some of those differences and get to some of the nuances that are dependent both in terms of tribal nation, but also urban communities versus reservation-based or rural communities. So as I said, not only when I first started looking into understanding violence against women, Native women, did I realize that these literatures are very entwined, but I quickly realized if I said I was interested in that, there are a lot of people that want me to understand that the whole problem of violence against Native women is because all Indians are drunks, and if we took care of that, we'd take care of the problem. I often say that it might just be an excuse, but I say I don't like to work on the airplane because I hate pulling out the work I'm doing and having somebody ask what I do and then being told what I need to do to take care of it. But strong feelings really on both sides of that, right? This narrative of alcohol misuse within our communities and our research really, there's a historian in the house. I'll give a challenge. We haven't done a good job of also disentangling the history of the introduction of alcohol and other substances into our communities. It's almost as if we've theorized it and stopped. And it's used as a way of explaining, but without disentangling what that really looks like. And in response to that, we also, I'll claim that within our communities, we have a very blunt sort of description and relationship to alcohol in terms of that nuance. So, it's called the white man's poison, right? This was introduced and it's often used as a way of explaining and being the core narrative for understanding any of the inequities that we experience. So you can imagine some of the implications for those stereotypes around drinking and the harmful effects of that. And I'm excited to see some of our research that is moving towards understanding the health outcomes of discrimination and microaggressions, strongly related to addictions research in tribal communities. We're also one of the few communities within the United States that actually have legal policies around the sales and consumption of alcohol on our lands, including tobacco. So not just the prohibition of alcohol, but the high rates of the sale of tobacco within our tribal lands. I always contextualize my work within a historical trauma framework. So thinking about events that were perpetrated in addition to genocidal federal policies, but specifically targeting our communities based on our group identity that caused catastrophic upheaval to our ways of lives. And I think of this as our health practices. So I think of that both in our relationships to substances and as well as in our relationships to others. And this framework, in addition to social determinants of health or structural violence frameworks, have really tried to point to power inequities as a way of understanding and contextualizing our historical and ongoing contemporary health disparities. So feminism has really, I think, been a core, Indigenous feminism particularly has informed a lot of the work that I've done, and thinking about the role of women-specific interventions. So as a response to historical trauma, a lot of our communities have tried to develop and successfully developed culturally specific interventions. Few of them have been focused specifically on female or women's interventions. So some of the areas that this is happening is in the restorative justice movement. Sarah Deer is a great theorist and researcher who writes a lot about gendered law and how the role of gender gets played out and how how tribes, particularly tribal justice systems, are responding to issues around violence or addiction that are gender specific. We also have some Indigenous interventions that are starting to articulate specifically the role of women. I work on one called Yopali, which is a substance misuse and obesity risk reduction program. It's with Choctaw women, it's with my tribe. And we actually targeted women for the interventions based in our tribal teachings that we were told that in our histories, when our communities were in a time of imbalance, women's roles were to restore that imbalance. So we're thinking about that in terms of restoring our own health and responding to issues around chronic diseases, substance misuse, and violence. there's been a tension between Western feminism and indigenous feminism. Some of the critiques have been that Western feminism has not adequately or outright ignored some of our tribal gender roles, our histories around matrilineal and matrilocal communities, and really not recognize the importance and the role of sovereignty in our work. So some of the critiques from indigenous feminists have been, you're asking us to respond to heteropatriarchy that comes from a European origin, and we're really trying to respond to settler colonialism and the enduring gendered violence. And that hasn't been adequately included in Western feminisms. So I feel like this is my plug for Native feminism. I think we have a lot to offer when we think it's inherently intersectional, in the sense that we're paying attention to issues around gender, but also nationhood. We have been critiqued that we're not feminist enough if we're focused on land rights and sovereignty in our evaluations of systemic gendered violence. And we think that's something we can offer. I think there's the possibility of challenging disciplinary and community silos in doing so, and really problematizing the intersections of settler colonialism and patriarchy. The thing that I think of often is, settler colonialism doesn't just affect Native populations, but it's also harmful for those who live within that system as settlers and as colonialists. And I think that the disruption of that and really articulating where those intersections are positive places for us to contribute to the conversation. I think the second to the last baton.
Hi there, my name's Elizabeth Roberts, and first of all, I wanted to thank everyone on this panel, since I'm learning so much being here and getting to hear from you all. And I really want to thank Jung for organizing this, who has become what feels like to me a fellow traveler as we learn about addiction together. So I'm new to addiction research, although not to addiction, of course. I think we all have long histories of knowing about what that is all about in many ways. So as it works often in anthropology, addiction came to me while I was doing something else. And maybe you noticed when I was being introduced, I do collaborative work with people in environmental health. I work on histories of toxic and environmental exposure in Mexico City. And currently, right now, I'm living in Mexico City this semester, engaged in a multidisciplinary project on water distribution in neighborhoods and in households, working with environmental engineers, sustainability researchers, and folks in public health. And I've been doing long-term collaborative work with this public health project for about 8 years in Mexico City now. And I started collaborating with them because I was quite interested in thinking through how we could have new models of research that brought together ethnographic work, which is what anthropologists do, with biomarker data that had been gathered in this exposure study for the last 25 years in Mexico City. And I've been trying to develop this model called bioethnography, which is combining these kinds of data. So I'm a medical anthropologist. I'm a feminist scholar of science technology studies. And in general, what I'm interested in is the relationship of health and inequality, especially in Latin America. So like I said, I've been working since 2012, collaborating with this environmental health birth cohort study in Mexico City. And the way that birth cohort got off the ground was by looking specifically at lead exposure through exposure to, it's in Mexico City, after lead was taken out of gasoline, the main form of exposure is domestic in terms of lead glazed ceramic dishes, and that people eat off. And if you've ever been to Mexico, you've probably eaten off of them as well. So I'm doing collaborative work with public health, environmental health, sustainability, and environmental engineering. And the other thing I am is an anthropologist who studies those disciplines as well. And I would say one through line through many of those fields, including many other kinds of helping professions that are based in the United States or that have been developed in the United States, is that they presuppose the individual. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is the folks that I work with in Mexico City who never presuppose the individual, and talk about what addiction is for them and how that in many ways changes what addiction is potentially. And I'm interested in thinking about this as maybe a useful way to rethink some presuppositions built into models of addiction as we engage in them in the United States. So in 2012, I began working with this subset of cohort participants in this environmental cohort study. So many of them have been in the study for up to 25 years. Some children were born in the study, literally, and they've been examined in terms of follow-up, in terms of chemical exposure, and the studies have exploded and study all kinds of things now. So what I propose to the environmental health scientists here at U of M who run this study is that I was going to get to know a subset of these families, to know a lot about their everyday lives so that we could start putting ethnographic knowledge about their everyday lives in conversation with all of this biomarker data. And that's been the plan ever since, and that's what we're doing with this water project right now. So when I started working with these families, actually immediately, it's a large subset for an anthropologist, but a very small subset for anyone who works in numerically based biological sciences. People started telling me something that it took me a very, very long time to hear. I was really open to what the topics were, but people were telling me a lot about addiction, and I wasn't listening because that's not what I was there to study. So people started telling me that they were addicted to these lead glazed ceramic dishes, and they started telling me that they were addicted to soda and a whole host of other things. And at first, I didn't pay what they were saying much mind in a literal sense. To me, they were talking in a hyperbolic metaphor, in the way that we in the United States talk about being addicted to chocolate or shoes, in this kind of like, kind of way. And we use addiction in all kinds of ways. And then you talk to addiction experts and they say, well, that's not true addiction, being addicted to chocolate or something like that. But over time, the ubiquity of these claims and the fact that these addictions were declared without shame meant that I started paying attention to what they were actually telling me. And I came to realize that their claims were not metaphorical. They were not making metaphorical claims about what their addictions were. And currently, I'm writing a book that right now is called Addicted Existence, Surviving Capitalism in a Drug War Age. And that's a huge part of what's going on here, the drug war, and we don't have that much time to talk about it. But the drug war has radically reshaped life in Mexico at all levels. Since 2006, when it was declared, there's over 100,000 people dead, 500,000 people missing. The ways that the drug war affects people's everyday lives in Mexico is staggering. And I would say the equivalent is the way that it has affected people's lives in disenfranchised inner cities in the US, but the rest of us don't feel it like most people feel it in Mexico. So what do I mean by addicted existence, which is what I think people are telling me? And I will give kind of a beginning attempt at a definition. What I mean is an acceptance and even celebration of shared compulsive dependency on substances with physiological effects that reinforce connection with others. And I'm just going to give you two quick examples and then try to frame it a little bit. So in terms of the lead glazed ceramic dishes, I've met many families over time who know they shouldn't use these dishes anymore because they're participants in the study. And they have acted out for me very dramatically what it has meant to them to put these dishes away and the kinds of withdrawals they've experienced. And there is no one way to talk about these withdrawals as just physiological or just social or just emotional. These are dishes that are in complicated ways passed down. And a lot of families actually hide their dishes and then bring them out for special occasions and continue using them in all kinds of ways. But they talk about them through addiction as a very physical experience. And then the one that might be a little more easy to understand is the way that people talk about soda. As probably a lot of you know, Mexico is now considered the #1 in most industrial obese nation in the world. And the rates of diabetes are rampant, and there's tons of campaigns to get people to stop drinking as much soda as they do. They are the #1 consumers of soda in the world as well, and Coca-Cola products in general. So the amount of time that I have witnessed or spent time with people telling me how they have tried to give up soda and how impossible it is, and this is a line that comes out all the time, especially among men, it's more addictive than what the narcos sell. But they're always doing it in a collective setting because both the dishes and the soda are things that you share with others and that connect you to other people. And these substances in other ways provide heightened dependency on other people. One other thing before I kind of frame this just a little bit more is that the working class neighborhoods I work in, addiction or drug use, illegal drug use is not hidden. It's very, very public. It's on the streets. People do a fair amount of drugs, and those folks are not stigmatized. What they're doing is not called addiction, and I'll get into that in a minute, but so one of the main drugs that's being used is this thing called Activo, which is basically pipe glue solvent that you can buy legally and inhale and provides pretty spectacular hallucinations, and it also makes you forget to start eating. So you look very obvious because these very young, thin men are wandering around and people want to eat them. But again, what they are doing is not called addiction, it's called vice. So just very quickly, the etymology of addiction, if you look back at the history of the word, it very much connects up to dependency, but also connotes devotion and sacrifice. This is different than vice, which has the connotation historically of a blemish that you can potentially cast out in different kinds of ways. But I would say that the people that I'm working with that are proclaiming themselves addicted, do not think of themselves as having a problem by being addicted. Dependency, in fact, is what life is all about. So I'll skip over a few things. And one other thing I will say before I get into this slide is that I've only started really recently talking about this kind of form of addicted existence to what I would call addiction experts. And they often talk about how, well, that's not real addiction because it's not physiological and it's not about withdrawal. And I would say that if I had more time, I could kind of take you through all the ways that this is a very, very physiological thing. It's not necessarily heroin, but we are talking about a relationship that's physiological. And a lot of my thinking about that is shaped by various feminist thinkers, philosophers, STS folks who complicate this distinction between the physiological and the mental, but also between biology and environment. And that is something that I feel like is what all of us here are doing in really interesting and complicated ways. So I would say the big difference between addiction, according to certain addiction experts, and the folks that I'm talking about in terms of what addiction is for them, is not whether or not it's physiological, but what is the status of dependency. And that for the folks that I'm hanging out with, dependency, again, is not the problem. It is actually the thing that solves your life. You need to be as dependent as possible on as many people as possible to survive. So all of the things they call addictions are, in fact, things that connect them to other people. And when they talk about things that take them away from other people, they start using the language of vice. So people, for instance, once I was hanging out talking to my landlady, Rosa, and her son-in-law, and they were talking about being addicted to the dishes we were eating off of and the soda they were drinking. Rosa's husband was upstairs sleeping off a bender. And she only talks about what he does in terms of vice, that is something that hopefully can be removed in different ways because it takes him away. So now, where are we? If you Google replacement addictions, you start coming up with all kinds of things, if they're US-based websites, that talk about the replacement of the dangers of replacement addictions. And then this is kind of like a very standard example. And this is quite different than someone like Renata, who's a good friend of mine, who's one of these, the mom in one of these families that I've been working with for a long time. She's a mother, she's a grandmother, she's a daughter, she's a sister, she's a wife, she's an aunt, she's a comadre, she's an entrepreneur, she's many, many things. And one day, as her son, who was a teenager, was telling me about how he just successfully managed to stop drinking soda, and he used to drink 6 liters of soda a day. She said, when I was saying, wow, I'm so impressed, everyone is addicted to something. If you give up one thing, you have to find a new addiction. And this seemed like it kind of coalesced this very different relationship to dependency. It's an expectation of dependency that we're going to be dependent on other people and substances help us connect to other people. So you need to find the right ones that don't damage your relationships. So Christian, her son, who gave up 6 liters of soda a day, managed to do that by making a promise to saints and his sisters in exchange for this. And he managed to do it by taking up a replacement addiction, very creatively and very consciously. And now he's an insane, obsessive skateboarder, which is very expensive, but it also helps him deliver food for his family's food business. So this is a way that he's able to be more immersed. And he had experienced himself as drinking the soda in ways that was damaging his relationships to others. So I now work, as I said, with public health and environmental sustainability experts and researchers in Mexico. I would say all of these fields are filled with incredibly smart people, but individualist models of addiction that only disdains any kind of excess consumption, I don't think works all that well. And I'm new to illegal drug research, so that's potentially another level, but I do think this presupposition of individuals is really, really something that we need to examine more deeply. So just in terms of thinking about environmental and health and sustainability, all of the campaigns that are prevalent in Mexico City to get people to stop taking drugs, to stop drinking soda, and to stop consuming so many disposable goods, for instance, all assume that these things are problems because they're discretionary foods, or in the case of soda, empty calories, which posits us as individuals who have no dependencies. This approach ignores that soda and paper party plates are for sharing often and for furthering dependencies. So what I'm trying to do is to think through on a potential model of addiction and vice, where instead of trying to extirpate dependencies, the model would instead ask which substances or activities damage our necessary relationships. We can call soda or video games or heroin vices and work towards their replacement, potentially. But to reiterate, the key would be to notice which dependencies these substances hold in place and not to banish dependency itself.
Okay, so now we just want to open the floor for questions and comments, and it's basically free for all.
It's a brawl.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Dr. Elizabeth Roberts, the book that you wrote, that sounds very interesting. Is it the correlation between the American capitalism and how it affects Mexico and the drug trade, or and is it published yet?
No, it is so only about a third written. So you're all going to help me figure out the best way to keep going here, and this has been terrific. But I wish I could have gotten a little more into the capitalism part, and I'll just say that. Capitalism basically causes the drug war in all kinds of ways that, and it has a lot to do with not really trying to staunch the flow of drugs coming from, say, Mexico to the U.S., but for allowing for the larger presence of transnational corporations in Mexico. So it's a lot about getting people off their lands so that mines can go in and extract. So, but the other thing that I'm really interested in, and I'm trying to weave through more, is the way that cheap consumer goods are the thing that people connect to others through. And that can be things like soda. And it is the thing that in the United States we revile so much, our overconsumption. And that's how these kind of like addiction becomes everything, because we drink too much soda or consume too much internet porn. Whatever it is, this idea that these things are readily available and the problem is our dependency on them. And for me, it's really interesting to spend time with people that actually don't feel bothered by that and think about the way that that might be one possible way to survive when the structural things that are making these things so available are actually, unless something radically changes, not going to be removed from the environments that we live in.
Such an impulsive culture we have.
But I would say in Mexico too, but they're not worried about the compulsion.
This question for the panel. You all kind of touched on how the European hierarchy and the Western medicine kind of patriarchal hierarchy influences addiction definitions and treatments. And those people are also the people that are holding the purse strings. And I was just wondering how you think, if you've noticed if funding is improving at all, if you're still seeing the constraints of all these, and if it will just perpetuate the same thought process if we give funding to the same studies. Are you optimistic at all?
So you're right that those forces that we're talking about that have created the problem also hold the purse strings and are trying to solve the problem. And one of the ironies for me as my research is basically epidemiologic research, is that on the one hand, we're talking about studying drug use in order to solve the drug use problem, right? To prevent it. But nobody really wants to prevent it because it's like social welfare for me. I mean, it funds my salary, it funds the University of Michigan, it does all kinds of things. And that tension is rarely talked about. So that's one answer to your question. Number two is, it is a system that requires you to be very flexible and nimble. Because when I said you have to follow the drugs if you want to stay funded by the NIH, I meant it. I started in heroin and teas and blues. You saw that. I now have 2 grants. One is e-cigarettes, and the other is looking at substance abuse severity with DSM-5 diagnosis. Now, I'm still looking at gender, and I'm still using my feminist lens, but these funded studies didn't have any of that in it when they were funded because the reviewers want incremental steps. They don't want big stuff. The reviewers generally don't. And I think the NIH doesn't want anything big. I mean, that it's a system that is siloed. And that's really unfortunate. But I do think that that's what happens is you follow the drugs.
And when it comes to looking at gender and sex differences in terms of addiction, there's now a mandate at the NIH that both males and females have to be studied in clinical studies and in animal studies. But the recent report on the opioid epidemic didn't mention gender or sex differences at all. And I wrote a commentary to that effect that was trying to change the direction of the report. But, feminism and sex or gender differences is really not a priority currently, in spite of the fact that everybody realizes that much of the opioid epidemic is a woman's problem.
I have a fair amount of experience with the NSF world, but I'm new to the NIH world. Carol's been amazingly helpful in that realm for me. No, it's good to be with the cynic. And one thing that I've noticed, which is not a surprise, but speaks to, I think, your question in many ways, is how it's impossible to do NIH research that is clearly engaged in any kind of structural critique or looking at structural issues. And so just 2 parts of that quickly is the grant that I just managed to put in. I mean, I'm hopefully feeling good about it. We had to focus it on obesity. This is again in Mexico, even though really I'm interested in what micro levels of neighborhood sociality do to what you could call the health of the neighborhood that could only be couched in terms of a negative health outcome, like obesity, that is based on individual behavior. And we had to I was working with a biostatistician. She knew how to do individual language. I didn't, but I had to work through that. But while we were doing that process, they got so interested in the fact that an anthropologist and a biostatistician were working together in a Latin American setting that they asked us to consult with this group about, my sense is that what's going on is that in Trump administration, NIH, certain groups are needing to really fight for their ability to exist. So they were going around and asking people that work in Latin America if it would make sense to keep a Latin American task force about obesity alive. And then we would say things and they would put it on the record. I think that's what was going on. And they were lovely, lovely people. But again, all of their focus was on individual things that can shape individuals' health outcomes and get them to stop eating fatty foods, instead of noticing, for instance, that in Mexico, Coca-Cola now owns most of the aquifer and it's cheaper than water. So the focus, again, is only on an individual approach to any of these issues like addiction, obesity.
Could you say a little bit more about either your work or the work of the others who you were mentioning about feminist approaches to addiction and from an intervention perspective?
Yeah, I would say that most of the indigenous feminisms are not in applied behavioral sciences. I was telling someone on my way down from here, as I came from the research and evaluation, there's a new MSW curriculum. I'm in the pathways for that. And I was saying it was kind of a breath of fresh air to get like the excuse to start reading, spend time this week reading about indigenous feminisms, because it's a very different, far more theoretical and different disciplines. I think where we see it coming, not explicitly labeled, but coming through are in the interventions that are attempting to restore some of our traditional practices that include specific responsibilities for different genders. So like the one I was talking about, Yopali, the project that I've worked on, we were intentional and have to justify this in NIH. Why? And you can imagine to an NIH reviewer why we say, because our tribal teachings teach us that historically, when we were in a time of imbalance, and we would argue, and a lot of the work around addictions is really can be conceptualized in a lot of indigenous conceptualizations of an imbalance, right? A spiritual imbalance. It's interesting that you're talking about connection. A lot of folks who are Native, who've been specific in the field of research, have approached some of these issues of addiction from a relational worldview. So even in our interventions, so changing a relationship to the spirit of alcohol, or changing a relationship to the spirit of the drug that you're using. That's how we relate. We relate to people, we relate to the land, and that, like anything, drugs and substances have a spirit to them, and that being an actual therapeutic intervention right there is changing that notion, right? And it was interesting when you were talking about like this replacing. So that's come up a lot for tribal communities around, speaking of NIH. To me, it's a very faddish funding process, right? So right now, opioids, and for tribal communities, it's around medication-assisted treatments, and why those aren't being accepted full force within tribal communities. And a lot of it is actually this resistance of this notion of it's replacing one addiction with another. So to circle back long haul to that, I don't think we're explicitly labeling any of our health interventions as feminist. But I did read in my fun reading excuse, thank you for giving me the chance. I read someone said that one of their favorite slogan is "Feminist since 1492," right? This notion that, up before that, we were doing these roles. We had roles for women. We had specific, particularly empowering roles and responsibilities that we held. We weren't called feminists until someone else decided, well, now you're a feminist if you're doing that. So I don't know if that totally answered your question, but.
Yeah, I'll try to articulate the best I can, but for Dr. Roberts, I found what you said just very validating and interesting. I mean, as a person in recovery and as a substance use counselor, it's like, I think colloquially we know that addiction is kind of like whack-a-mole, and we're kind of just chasing it. We're going from AA to SLAA to OA, and it's just like really interesting that that's not talked about. There's not really a space for holding all of those different compulsive behaviors, but my question was, you were talking about like dependency is what life is all about in Mexico, whereas here it's so much the opposite. And you see groups like CODA, like Codependents Anonymous, Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous, and like I'm still thinking about it, but like how's capitalism responsible for that as well? Conceptualization of like dependency as that, and also validating that yes, that is someone's experience and they are struggling with how it relates. Sorry.
No, thank you very much. It's really moving to me that you would find it to speak to what you've experienced, because it's a little nerve-wracking to start talking about things like soda and lead-glazed ceramic dishes with people who have dealt with other kinds of substance abuses. Although, believe me, a lot of this I'm modeling off of people's pretty painful addictions in my own family as well. I think I don't have a perfect answer for what, and that's why I'm so excited to do this, because I want literally you all to help me figure out really what I'm trying to do in this book. But I think part of the issue is getting back to this issue of the individual. And I don't think we're going to solve or fix public health if we only direct things towards individuals. And Latin America has a really long, amazing history of social medicine where public health was actually about housing policy. That's gone. It's been gone for the most part for the last 20 years since what we would call neoliberalism has come to bear. So what public health looks like in Latin America now, it looks like what it looks like in the United States in so many ways, which is molecularized and individualized in all these kinds of ways. I don't think this model of vice or addiction and just accepting that we're all compulsive and dependent is going to fix capitalism. But at least we can stop blaming people for the fact that we're compulsive, and especially compulsive when there's so much available to us. And what's available to us actually feels really good when you share it with other people. James Jackson, who's here, has done a lot of really interesting work among African-American communities and how African-American women should be sicker given the amount of junk food they eat, but at the same time they eat it with other people. And for some reason, the health, sure, there's plenty of health issues, but it's not what it should be. And there's interesting and suggestive things about the collective nature of doing these things together. So I would love it in Mexico if they just stopped having billboards telling people to stop drinking soda when there's nothing else to drink. That would be just one small step. That doesn't solve the Coca-Cola owning the aquifer problem, or the fact that soda actually is cheaper than water. But one thing I find really powerful is the absolute uninterest in feeling shame about the fact that they are drinking so much soda. And that seems like it could be useful in the United States. I just had a taxi ride with a former pastor of a church recently, and he told me that he left being a pastor because he became a high school guidance counselor and he became a Lyft driver because he was so upset that people were coming to him and he felt like they were looking to fill a hole in their life, and that they were alcoholics, and then they were coming and they were just trying to replace alcoholism with religion, and that was so upsetting to him. And I felt destroyed for him. That is so sad. Like, but that seems kind of good. Like, what's wrong with that? But he was so upset that people would have any dependencies at all. he had to leave the church because that sense of needing to be an individual was so strong. And I think we see that in the US in a pretty deep and profound way. Thank you.
So I have questions for all of you, but I'm going to ask Jill my question. I know that you were talking about the sex differences in addiction in the brain, and I was wondering if anyone has done any work in terms of the effects of trauma. So we know that substance use affects the brain in terms of structure and function. We know that trauma affects the brain in terms of structure and function. And so together, when you have someone, and typically people who are addicted to drugs have been traumatized, they often have a long history of trauma and you know, many times find a level of, you know, coping and trying to deal with their trauma through substances. And so has anyone looked at sort of the co-occurrence of trauma and substance use and what that does to the brain structures and functions?
Yeah, so the answer is yes, this is something that people are looking at clinically and with animal models. So we're looking, and it's very clear that there are different effects of early trauma in girls and boys on the outcome in terms of boys tend to have more mental health issues. Women actually tend to end up with more drug abuse problems as a result of early trauma and sexual abuse. And you know, I actually do some experiments modeling this in my rats, and we see that you have different effects in males and females versus the pattern of drug taking that results as a consequence of early trauma. And it can happen either if the mother is stressed as well as if the child is stressed during development. So all of this is affecting how the brain develops and how they respond to drugs of abuse. Yeah, it's a really important point.
Okay, I think we're running out of time. If anyone has like one last question you want to bring?
But thank you, everyone. This was so wonderful. I have so many thoughts and so many questions. My question is for Dr. Schultz. How do we better incorporate Indigenous perspectives in schools of social work? And clearly, we're really behind. But yeah, how do we begin to tap into? We talked about Indigenous feminism and the way in terms of the way forward, because I know like we often first day of class, people will often acknowledge, okay, we're on Indigenous land. That's it. Mm-hmm. Even in a school social work. So how do we do better?
Well, I'm working on that. I want to know the answer for that as well. I mean, I think as all of us have talked, there are structural issues, right? There are structural issues around who gets represented in these systems, both as students, as staff, as faculty, and as administration. That's a whole nother panel, right? And then there are the pragmatic ways that we start to think about how we integrate that in our content, in our classrooms. So I also want to say that I think this goes beyond just when I say Indigenous ways of knowing or Indigenous worldviews from an American Indian or Alaska Native or First Nations, original peoples. I think this is true for most of our underrepresented voices in the academy, right? And, you know, being inspired by the cite Black women authors, right? How do we do that in our scholarship, the movement of that, and assigning readings that are written by Indigenous and other underrepresented scholars, and making the space. Like, I will be honest, there's often an uncomfortable space when I sit in an academic setting and talk about having a relationship with the spirit of alcohol, right? And I came out of a shop at the University of Washington under the guidance of some very strong Indigenous health researchers, and who are also, we talk about in our tribal communities, we often honor our ancestors. We start out by saying, if I go into community, I talk about who I come from. And we always joke that we need to honor our academic ancestors as well. So I named Dr. Karina Walters. I named the people that have also, Dr. Tessa Evans Campbell, people that have worked to really make the space to start to open that door a little bit, and that the door's cracked. I wish it was wider, but it's cracked open a little bit. And so, like I said, I think there are structural and very pragmatic ways we can start to do that. And part of it is also having the courage to do. I was saying it is uncomfortable, and sometimes I have to say to myself, like, I know this to be true. I know this to be science, right? That there's Western science, and we are also scientists, and we have something to contribute to that, and that's a valuable space to be in. So.
Please join me to give a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you everyone for coming, and I hope everyone leaving the room with some more questions about addiction, if not conclusions. And if any of you need to sign up on the CEU, please do that by the day. And so that's it. Thank you so much.